So this talk will be made by someone very special. It's his second time here. He was the co-creator, director, and also producer of the UN's first ever VR film, Clouds Over Sidra. I think everywhere where I've been all over the world to see VR, I've seen this masterpiece. He is also the founder and president of Lightshed, a VR and social impact startup, and is himself an award-winning filmmaker. It is Gabo Aurora, and I'm really very happy, Gabo, that you're here. And Gabo is going to tell us what does it mean to care about the sufferings of other people in faraway zones of conflict. And also, in this talk, he will explore how VR, with its immersive capabilities, can represent and shape our own relationship to the pain of others. It's not easy, and it's very important. So thank you, Gabo. Tell us more about this. And yeah, thanks.
Okay. Hello, Berlin. I love being back here. It's a great city. I want to go through a little bit of this talk is usually in 3 parts, and depending on how I feel, we'll see how far we get. And if not, there'll be some things left for you for next time. I was very fortunate almost 3 years ago to be one of the first people to be able to use VR for live action capture and to make a VR documentary. Before I decided to do that, that was kind of a crazy idea. There wasn't necessarily a lot of belief that people would want to put on a headset and go to these faraway places, and whether it's a refugee camp, whether it was an Ebola clinic, whether it's a concentration camp, which was a crazy idea because people thought that VR is really just for gaming and for entertainment. What's been really encouraging, I think, in the past 3 years is that there definitely is and definitely seems to be something that people are gravitating towards for using this medium for something more than just that. And so I want to just start with the first part of this talk. What happened was, after Clouds Over Sidra and we would show it to people, I think people were really enamored by the technology when I kept telling them that there was a philosophical point of view that I was trying to take, that we were trying to take, that was different than, just the technology, that there's a certain way that one needs to design these experiences in order to elicit empathy. Yes, I said it, the empathy machine. I believe in it. I know it's a controversial topic, but that's just clickbait. I just want to say that for everyone else. But we'll go through that a bit here too. So for me, when I was given this chance, a lot of people just said, oh, VR is so powerful, you don't really need to do much. You can just place the camera, show the suffering of other people, and it's going to be enough. And I knew intuitively that wasn't right. But also, there's a really great thinker called Susan Sontag, who wrote a book called Regarding the Pain of Others, of which this title is alluding to, where she discusses in the birth of photography how people said the same thing and had the same sort of mistakes, because VR gives you this immersiveness, this ability to really teleport you. And I think it's similar to when photography was birthed, where people said, wow, with photorealism, we can represent the truth, we can show suffering, and it will stop. And I think, those are the parallels that I want to kind of explore here a bit. But, what's important, so much of a lot of my work is photoreal, but I think it's important to remember that it really is the abstract storytelling. It really is things that start out that don't necessarily have to be that way, that can still elicit a lot of empathetic response. And I think I bring, this sort of cave thing here. It's a little bit of a cliche. But I think for a lot of people, when I started out in VR, they just thought it was very unnatural to use it to tell certain stories. And I think a VR headset is really just a cave on your face, is what I want to say. And I think that's there in some ways. So this is from the Napoleonic era. And I bring this up also because this is considered to be war painting peak. And this is right before photography is about to come onto the scene. And there had never been more sort of representations of war and suffering. And a big part of that was that around this time, like in the Napoleonic Wars and everything, it was the first time that monarchs were not going into the battlefield, and there was this real need to try to figure out what was happening on the battlefield and to communicate that back. But then photography comes, and this is one of the first photographs that we have from the American Civil War. And it's a very meta picture because it shows you now that the camera is encroaching itself upon the battle scene. So this is a hill, and these are senators and civilians and journalists who are looking over the battlefield. And here is the camera coming slowly into what is going to be the first sort of documentation of real sort of suffering in that way. So, a lot of these sort of initial sort of photographs were passed around, and a lot of people's intuitive thing was, look at the horror of war now. You can finally see it. You can finally bear testimony to it. It should stop, but it doesn't stop. It doesn't stop. Why doesn't it stop? Right. So we'll go through that a bit. One could say that World War I was the first photographed war where it changed our relationship to violence. Vietnam brings moving images and television. Syria, one could argue, is the first YouTubed war where you have user-generated sort of content. Again, using the same idea that let me show you how horrible it is and then things will stop. Black Lives Matter was the first time there was a live killing on like people could watch something live happening that was horrible. And VR, where does that fit in within this whole thing? VR is going to absolutely, I think, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Jaron Lanier, who's the kind of godfather of VR. His sort of thinking is that we better figure out a lot of what we're doing before VR really kicks in, because it's going to change how we, what we can do to people and how they can be manipulated. And it isn't the first time. Without VR, people have been trying to use images for manipulation or to convince you of other things. So I think VR is this whole new realm where I think we're going to have to see. But there's a lot to learn from the past. So, this is a book called War Against War that basically takes 40 of the worst images from World War I, and its whole purpose was to prevent World War II. By 1930, it had gone through 10 editions in Germany, had been translated in many languages, and again, it didn't necessarily stop what we were trying or what people were intending to do. These are some images from Vietnam as well. Again, now things are moving, but it's the same sort of thing to kind of overwhelm you with shock and awe of what's happening, as an example. I hope this works. This, I hope, is the right video. This is just an example of some of the user-generated stuff from the internet for the Syrian civil war. Okay, so this will not be the right one, I'm sorry. And this is some of what you could see from Facebook, which was the Facebook Live thing. So why doesn't it work? I think first off, we grow numb to these images if they're just shocking and sensational. It isn't just from me saying that. We have years and years of research from public health sort of facilities that say that if you want to change someone's behavior, if you want to get people to act, it isn't really a good strategy to scare them. So using, showing horrible pictures of dead people or showing, all of those things don't necessarily don't necessarily stop you from doing it. It can have the counteracting effect on it. Yet some of the ones that are actually kind of successful are a little bit more metaphorical. And, you know, they rely on your brain being an egg. And it's really weird. I know this is a strange thing, that this is an anti-drug campaign, but in the United States, this was considered one of the more successful ones, that instead of showing you somebody with an overdose, just horrible, laying in a hospital, using metaphor and storytelling actually had a greater effect. This is a little bit of animated things. It is working. This is another one that I thought was really funny, that, you know, should be updated for an iPhone now, I think, in that way. You know, so a lot of it is, you know, that numbness is also a result of that passivity that I think dulls feeling. And I think you look at pictures like this of Ilan, the 3-year-old boy who was washed up on shore, and, you know, you wonder how many times or what it would take to continue to have this have the same impact on you to do something about it. Now, this is from UNICEF's sort of pictures from the 80s, where they also had fallen for the same sort of thing, you know, where just show horrible things and try to raise money and to do it. And if there's a thing, this is not how UNICEF works now, working in that way. These make me cringe now, but this was actually considered to be very normal, because it has this short-term impact to get people to get into it, but then it's not going to continue to work. It's going to be something that's going to be difficult. This is also just a little snippet from the 80s and the early 90s.
We'll grow up in dungeons like this. Happy birthday. I've been asked if I've ever gotten used to this misery. How does a human being with a heart get used to this? The heartbreaking crying of a 2-year-old so undernourished her teeth are coming loose. The sight of a child so starved he's too weak to cry. And one so dehydrated by diarrhea he doesn't even have the tears to cry with. No, I can't get used to this any more than you could, but we can get rid of it. Yes, we can. You and I and CCF. Your 70 cents will put life-giving medicine into a dying little body, nourishing food into a little stomach.
That's not how things are done now. If you go to the UNICEF page now, there's a lot more storytelling, there's a lot happier faces, there's a lot more nuance. And the point is, it's not just a human dignity argument, it's an efficacy argument. This makes more money. This does better, because you can sustain it, you can sustain hope, you can build it with nuance and storytelling so that there's a little bit more complexity than just shocking and sensational images. So I think with VR, it was important because it was so tempting that now that we can give you this visceral response, it's very tempting just to look at it and to see horrible things. And my point is that doesn't make sense that's not how we want to do it in this new medium, because I think it's not necessarily going to be what changes it. Now, rather than also, besides growing numb to these sensational and shocking images, we also have a lustful relationship to violence. I gave this talk somewhere in the south of the United States or somewhere, and people said, you know, someone came up to me who said that he did not have a lustful relationship to violence, that, you know, everyone else might. But, you know, I think that doesn't mean necessarily that we act and we do horrible things with it, but there is something attractive to showing horrible things that can kind of engage us, but not necessarily inspire us to action. You know, whether it's Clockwork Orange or whether it's the original Christ myth, whether it's an accident on the highway that you just slow down and you look over, but you don't necessarily stop to do anything about, but you're curious to see what it is. I think it's the similar thing, whether it's with photography or video or even now VR. You can have a counteracting sort of thing where if you show something horrible, it can just kind of play to that kind of pornographic side to us that wants to just look at it but not necessarily do something about it. Thirdly, if you use sensational, shocking images of, you know, especially if you are using it to say that this is a horrible thing. For instance, you know, if I show you a video of a cop or a white person killing a black person, you might feel enraged, but if you're a racist, you might not, you know? You might feel the complete opposite. You might feel very happy, you know? So the similar types of showing what it is, you know, in the case here of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you know, the suffering of people has a very different context depending on who's watching it and what side you're on. The same picture of Aylan that was used to motivate Europe or other people in the West to take in refugees was used by ISIS itself as a kind of warning that that same picture, this is what happens if you leave. And again, this counteractive thing of what could happen if you don't rely on something deeper of what you can do to motivate people to do something about issues, about people that are far away. So, you know, just as a summary, you know, sensational, shocking pictures, they kill storytelling. I always give the example of Cloud Landsman's Show, a documentary, which is 9.5 hours long, and you should all watch it. And it uses no archival footage, yet is considered the standard bearer and the gold standard of building empathy and of getting people to be moved on an issue that, you know, was very difficult at the time. A lot of it is about the use of the imagination and how these shocking and sensational images, they paralyze the imagination. And without imagination, there's no empathy. So how do we build VR experiences on these things and allow there to be this ability for you to imagine or to abstract? And, you know, that's an important thing to think about. Some examples that I think are not VR, but still, you know, very good, is Silvered Water, which was at Cannes, I think, in 2014. It uses all of the YouTube footage. I couldn't show you some of the examples here, but there's incredible amount of YouTube footage from Syria, and it uses a lot of it that a lot of users had put in. It had built a kind of broader meta-poetic narrative that I think is very interesting, rather than just showing you dead bodies. And it really is, I think, an interesting example. You know, migrant mother, I mean, this has been, if you want to go down a rabbit hole of interesting things, which is a bit of a tangent, there's a lot of incredible reporting on this mother and what this photo has meant to her throughout her life as she was alive. But for regardless, this sort of photo, because it allows for you to have to take a deeper layer to go and use your imagination and try to understand pain and try to understand and interpret, I think is an example of how we'd want to do things in VR, and why I think Clouds Over Sidra, all the other things I've done, you know, we've tried to kind of do a similar type of thing where it's not so on the nose. My most recent experience, The Last Goodbye, which was an official selection at the Venice Film Festival and it world premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival, is on the Holocaust. And as I was doing research, you look at these photos, and in of themselves, these photos, you know, of course, they make you feel something just looking at it, because you can tell it's a camp. But the caption, you know, on this one in the museum I saw in Poland was, "This is the last moment before people were put into a gas chamber. Like, this is their last moment they're alive." And you kind of wonder if, you know, that older brother holding his younger brother's hand, you know, does he know, or is he being brave? Or this mother over here with her pursed lips, you know? I mean, I think that's where you get goosebumps, and that's where I think building even in VR, we can't fall for the same traps in that way. You know, this is from Mouse, which is a graphic novel where people are represented as animals, even though it's a, I had to have a Hitler slide in Germany, obviously, right? It's a bad joke. So, you know, this is something that was an interesting abstract decision by Artie Spiegelman, where he represented the different ethnicities as animals. And if he didn't do that, I think it would have related a very different emotional impact. And there is something to using abstraction and storytelling in that way. So, you know, that's just the first part that I always go through that I think is important to just let people know that when people saw Clouds Over Cedar or people watch a VR experience that is there to elicit empathy, it's not just the technology. It's the technology with a philosophical storytelling approach that leads to greater empathy, right? And it's about understanding that if you don't necessarily work hard at understanding how it would work within this new medium, it's not going to be an empathy machine. That so much of empathy is storytelling, mixing with the right strengths and weaknesses of a new medium, which is VR in that way. So sorry for being pedantic, but I thought it was important to do that. I hope you're okay. Is everyone bored here? All right, you're a tough crowd in Germany. All right, so part 2 of this talk, how am I with time? I have no idea. Oh, Jesus, okay. So, you know, I think another thing that is very interesting to think about why I think VR and using it to kind of motivate people for some of the most important issues of our time, a lot of it comes from my many years working at the United Nations. And usually at the UN when I was there, and we want to get people to care about something important, we would go to these guys and we would say, talk about it, or let's do it, or maybe we'd write an op-ed. And I think, you know, those types of things are old news and not necessarily things that are going to work. You know, if you even just look at the UN's YouTube channel, it has abysmal views, which is, you know, is it because nobody cares about these issues? You know, when you have, you know, maybe it's the type of storytelling it is. You know, when you get Angelina Jolie, the numbers go up a bit, but I think, you know, this is what we're really up against in some ways. But I would argue that, you know, there is a way, and before I did VR, there is a way, again, with a certain type of storytelling that I think is people-centered and focused that could really work. This was one of my earlier sort of projects for the Climate Change Summit called Keep the Oil on the Ground, which was, you know, using that sort of way. I think a great example, I co-produced and worked with Brandon Stanton's Humans of New York for a UN tour, where again, you know, it allows room for the imagination, it allows room for things, and I think a lot of it is where I've learned, you know, until we've come up with what we were doing with Clouds Over Cedar. So, the empathy machine. I think there's a lot of discussion about this. If you Google it, or if you do VR, empathy machine, you'll see there's a debate raging of whether VR is an empathy machine, or it's ridiculous to use it or not. And I think a lot of it is really built on, you know, what your definition of empathy is. And I think, you know, people really look at it differently. And I think when we were doing it at the UN, I just really said, let's stop and let's think about what it means to us. And so this is, I won't go through this, but I think this is just a little bit of how we would design for it and think about it. You know, I think what's been most exciting about a lot of the VR work I did at the UN, and even afterwards, that it's led to certain reactions and also certain campaigns that have been very exciting. In the beginning, we used VR because it's limited to basically just show it to decision makers and leaders and millionaires and people at Davos. But eventually, I realized that UNICEF has these face-to-face fundraisers that exist in 40 different countries and 15 different languages, and they stop people on the street every minute of every day just asking you to help certain issues. And I thought to myself, what if we outfitted them with VR headsets, you know, little mini ones that they could even use their own smartphones. So we did a first pilot project in New Zealand, and just to see what the reaction would be from the volunteers or some of the people working. And this was one of the first videos that we had.
The girl in the video was only like 3 years younger
Put it
than me, and the boys running around were my brother's age.
It gave me a real sense of appreciation for what I've got here.
I felt as if I was actually there, and I could actually feel the pain of the children and their suffering.
Made the people seem so alive, and I think that's really important with this. The people have to be alive in order for change to happen.
It was something that I don't want to believe is happening, but I can't ignore it anymore.
I knew about what was going on, but I didn't really know the extent of everything. that happened there.
Open one arm and then the other and then walk towards a person and then hug them.
What are you doing? Like, why are basic human rights still being denied in the 21st century? Why are there still people falling dead on the streets? Why do humans feel the need for war?
My sorrow is one based on, me coming to school when it's raining. For them, it's not even being able to go to school.
Yeah, it really makes you feel for what's happening in that situation.
They said that it will kind of pass, like the clouds, and I thought that was really inspiring.
How they can just find happiness in a place where there's not going to be much.
These were other girls like me going through it and actually thinking and feeling how they are feeling.
There's just so much children who need our help and so much people we need to reach out to.
So, when we got that video back, I knew something was starting to happen. We had gotten a lot of other, we had gotten a lot of other feedback from the press and from a lot of things, but I knew that if that was happening, we needed to stop people on the street and give them a sense of what it was. And we were able to, let me show you just a really other little quick video here. So this is actually, those volunteers or those workers, they don't make that much money, they stopped people and then started putting these headsets. And usually when you stop people, like let's say in the streets of Berlin, 1 in 12 people will give if they're stopped on the street. With a 4-minute experience of Clouds Over Sidra, I cut it down to 4 minutes, and having them see it, it led to 1 in 6 people giving it. It was doubling the rate of donation. And this is in 40 different countries, in 15 different languages. This is Trump supporters. This is Hillary supporters. This is across the political spectrum. It's not people you stop on the street, you don't know what their political leanings are. So, to me, I think it's so far the first return on investment, of VR ever, I think, in the sense of people say, how does VR make money? Well, we made money. We continue to make money. How does it make an impact? I think this is another sort of way of saying that this is something we could do. I love money. I think money is really important, but I think, you need to be more creative on how you can use it. And the third experience I did, which was at the Tribeca Film Festival, not this year, last year, My Mother's Wing, it was about a family in Gaza, and I spent a week in Gaza, and it basically, we showed it and world premiered it in Tel Aviv and showed it in the streets of Tel Aviv. So instead of asking for money, we had a questionnaire to ask regular Israelis of whether it changed their opinion on what their knowledge base was on the Palestinian conflict. And we got some very good initial results that we'll publish eventually. But again, showing that there's a whole different, the weaknesses of VR can become its strength, And so we shouldn't we should just be more creative on how we can use this thing. I know people will say, well, you can't distribute it, you can't make money out of it, no one can watch it, But there is a way. There's an opportunity in every new medium. And I think that's what's really important. I think we're done. So thank you.